in this episode of the Critical Oxygen Podcast.
I think the benefit of these things, like wearables in general, is if it can bring your attention to it. So if it makes people pay attention to, I tend to go, like, I've been going to bed after 10 o'clock every night, or like things like that. If it makes you pay attention to your sleep habits or your recovery habits and things like that, then I think they can be a good tool.
Welcome to the Critical Oxygen Podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your endurance potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson. I have a PhD in molecular exercise physiology, and I'm the founder of Critical Oxygen, where my mission is to build better endurance athletes through remote education and in-person physiological testing. Today I'm joined by Dave Schell, founder and head coach of Kaizen Endurance, for another episode of Fast Physiology, where we do a succinct dive into a single endurance topic. In today's episode, we are going to explore the question, how to use heart rate variability, or HRV, for training. Enjoy. Dave Schell, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Phil.
Yes, so another hot topic that has been circulating around training forums, endurance forums, those sort of things, is heart rate variability. And I cut you off, Dave, because you started to say some things about heart rate variability, and I wanted to catch it on our audio recording. So what's your experience with HRV? And do you use it? How do you use it? What's your perspective on it?
Oh man, this could be just a 60-minute monologue of my trials and tribulations with HRV. So first off, I think it's a really interesting number, and for people that aren't familiar with HRV, the idea is that our heartbeats aren't perfectly in rhythm. Like the time between them isn't always the same, and the more rested we are, the more variability there is between beats, and the less rested we are, or the more under stress we are, or under duress, the less variability there is. And so from that standpoint, it sounds like this really interesting tool that could help you to know, should you do a hard workout today, or do you need more rest because you slept poorly, or things that aren't captured in your training data. In my experience, so I'll just give a quick anecdote here. At the beginning of the pandemic, Whoop was doing a promotion where if you signed up for 6 months, you got a free Whoop strap. So I bought one, and a bunch of my athletes bought one, and then we tracked the data for 6 months. Mm-hmm. And over 6 months, I never found any correlation between subjective feedback or training load. And so because of that, we kind of stopped using it. And I would say that in my experience, a lot of people, and this is where you cut me off so that we could start recording, is that it's a very promising metric, but the problem is it's not as simple as just measuring it randomly over the course of the day or over the course of the night. You have to be very specific in how and when you measure it in order for it to have meaning. And so I think that's a great place for us to start.
Yeah, I mean, if people haven't taken away, anything from the Fast Physiology talks, it's like one of the things that you should take away is that a tool is a tool. Yeah. And it should, if used properly, be benefiting your decision-making process for training. If it's just providing you with more noise, then get rid of it, because it's not help pushing you forward. It's just getting in the way of what is actually why we train, which is better performance. Right? So I want to, and I'll probably say this on every single Fast Physiology podcast going forward, but we have to understand what our tool, what our data is measuring, and what is influenced by it in order to actually understand the nuances of it, right? It's like we released an episode on lactate, and we talked about all the things that could affect lactate. Well, there's a hell of a lot of things that can influence heart rate variability. But before we go into that, you did a great job of summarizing it. Heart rate variability is trying to determine the differences or the minute changes in rhymicity between heartbeats. Your heart just doesn't beat every second, for your entire life. You don't just have 60 beats per minute. It's like 49, 50, 37, 55, so and that's like beat to beat. So what heart rate variability is trying to quantify, and there's a lot of different algorithms to actually try to quantify this, is the difference in those beats. And by quantifying those differences, larger numbers typically mean that you have more rest and digest or parasympathetic nervous system activity. Lower numbers, where your heart is beating more consistently, is associated with higher fight or flight, stress response, or sympathetic nervous system activity. So what you will find is that if you are kind of resting or, meditating, nose breathing, those sort of things, your HRV will be elevated. And then if you go for a run, because exercise is a stress, if you didn't know that, exercise is a stress on the body. There is a huge sympathetic response to exercise. You will find that your heart rate variability goes down. And the reason why people started to use this is that there was some studies that came about that started to look at how heart rate variability changes over time. So day-to-day heart rate variability and what it means. So, like the way that it's been described to me and how it's supposed to be used is that you measure your heart rate variability either at night or immediately when you wake up, and you track those changes over time. Because just like lactate, there's no one number that is going to tell you if you have a good heart rate variability or a bad heart rate variability. Some people are going to have HRVs, depending on how you measure it, of 120. Other people are going to have HRVs of 40. But both of those people could be completely healthy. It's just differences in physiology that then result in differences in those baseline numbers. The reason why you track it over time is you want to see if there's trends in where those numbers are going. So if this person with 120 goes from 120 to 110 to 105 to 75 or something along those lines, that's a downward trend. That means that most likely they are now in a more sympathetic state. They're in a more stressed out state. So presumably they're probably overtaxing the nervous system, meaning they're stressing themselves out too much. And by keeping going in that trajectory, they're probably going to wind up with, some sort of, like burnout or injury or sickness or something along those lines. On the flip side of things, you could have somebody who's at that 40 level go 40, 41, 41, 41, 42, 45, 50, and that would indicate that maybe their parasympathetic system is actually being stimulated even more. Doesn't mean that they're actually more recovered, because you're only looking for ranges, which makes it even more confusing, because you want to stay within your normal ranges. You don't want to be too far outside, because that is saying that there's some level of stress that is influencing your nervous system one way or the other. So overall, I think I just confused myself a little bit more by trying to explain that. But overall, heart rate variability, the idea is that it can help you track stress over time. But, from what Dave, you were saying, you did not see how that actually translated.
Based on the way it was measured. And so
Yes.
that, I think that's the important thing, is that my understanding, and you had talked to Marco Altini, I talked to Simon Wegeroff, who also developed an HRV app years ago, and he was very specific about how it had to be measured. And so it's like a lot of these devices just take a random measurement over the course of the day, or take several
or
over the course of the night. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and then they average it out. And so that can be an issue. And I think you brought up a good point where it's like, with any data, we shouldn't ever trust one data point. We're always looking for trends. And so with this, I think a lot of people want this. I wake up, it gives me a number, it tells me whether I should do something today. And that's not been my experience. I have seen, if we're tracking it over time, I definitely have seen trends. As people take on more training load, I start to see it fall. As they start to get recovered, it starts to rise. But I'll also say that it seems to be the inverse of resting heart rate. and resting heart rate is a lot more easy to measure
Yeah.
in my experience. So for me, it's like that one seems more reliable, less variability to it and stuff like that. And no pun intended. So I think there's some of that too, but it's also like my other beef with it is I think people have started to lose touch with how they feel. And so I might have an athlete that wakes up feeling great, and then all of a sudden they look at their recovery score and it's like, oh, actually, I must feel like shit today. I must not have slept as well as I thought I did, or I might, And so as I go off on this tangent, I just like the other thing that I got from Simon Wegerup is a lot of times it might not even be that, like, it may not reflect the way you feel, but it might be your ability to adapt to a training stress. You know, and so it's like, yeah, you can still go do that hard workout, but you might not get the optimal benefit from it if your body's not in a place to receive that training that day.
Yeah, I like that thought process behind it as well. I've talked a lot about the stress bucket analogy. Is when you start to, so you have a bucket and it's filled with all of your stresses. The faucets are all of the stresses of your life, your exercise, your family stuff, your maybe nutritional stuff, lack of sleep, like every single thing possible. And the closer that bucket gets to the top, the less stress you can add to your stress bucket, right? Like it makes sense before overflowing. And maybe heart rate variability is kind of giving us an idea of how close to full that stress bucket actually is, rather than saying, oh, your body's ready to exercise today or not ready to exercise today. It's how capable are you of actually receiving this stress, and presumably when you get to higher and higher bucket capacities, your ability to actually take on more stress actually goes down. So that zone 2 workout that doesn't actually create that much stress might be the tipping point, right, of having the water flow over. If you did a hard workout that day, like good luck. Like, it's like you're gonna make everything pour over and then some, and that's where injury, sickness, other things like that occur, right? One thing I do want to talk about though is when you measure HRV, because this is a really important distinction that that Marco and I talked about. Is he said, if you measure HRV throughout the night, so I use an Oura ring, and I've kind of since stopped listening to it. I just kind of listen to my body, and I just take everything fairly easy, go hard when I feel okay. But HRV is measured on the Oura ring periodically throughout the night. Same with Whoop. And what this does is it captures, or it is more influenced by what you did leading up to going to bed rather than the overall training load. So just I want everybody to be aware of this, is that if you're measuring HRV throughout the night, it's going to be more affected by if you drank alcohol that night, if you smoked weed, if you had a fight with your spouse before going to bed, if if you ate a lot of food. That was one thing that's always really, really lowered my Oura HRV, is eating too much food before going to bed. And it doesn't even have to be that much food. It's just eating too much and in too close of proximity to actually going to bed, or taking a hot bath. That's another one. If you elevate your body temperature, that's a stress. Exercising too close. There's all of these different things that will artificially depress your HRV, and it's an acute thing, because by the time you wake up in the morning, your HRV will have come down, your resting heart rate will have come down, and all of that sort of stuff. So the flip side of things is measuring your HRV immediately in the morning when you wake up. And this is, I believe, or from the conversation I had with Dr. Altini, this is what he kind of said, is that you should measure it when you wake up, because that is so far removed from any of the food consumption or anything like that that could be affecting it during the night, that you're going to get a more global picture of what's actually going on in the morning, as long as you're measuring it in the same state every single day. It's like, you wake up, you go to the bathroom, you sit down for 5 minutes, and then you measure it.
Yep.
And you want to do it in a sitting position, because that's a little bit of a stress on your cardiovascular system rather than laying down. And you want to have a small stress so that you can get rid of any of the, potential like other effects of just like laying down or other things like that. Because again, you're trying to figure out, how is my body adapting to the overall stress load of life and training more specifically? And should I train that day? Whereas if you measure it at night, it's like, oh, well, we learned a valuable lesson here. You ate a whole pizza right before you went to bed, and your heart rate variability was through the floor. It's like, yeah, because you were trying to digest that food all night.
Yeah.
So I just want to make people aware of that. If you're truly trying to get at the training adaptations and how your body is coping with training, I would highly recommend measuring it in the morning. If you're going to measure it at night, just know that it could be affected by so many variables.
Yeah, and I think one of the takeaways for me here, and this came up in the lactate one as well, is, and I think you mentioned that at the beginning here, is like we have all these tools, but it's really important to know the limitations of the tools. And so I'd kind of mentioned in jest offline that I think a lot of athletes are looking for the one metric or one number to rule them all. And that it's super attractive. We want this thing that's going to tell us, work out today and you're going to adapt. Don't work out today. Take a rest day. Like we want that. Well, bodies are super complicated. And so I think we should use all these things, but we have to kind of take them with a grain of salt and look at everything in context and not just let this one thing be the dictator of whether or not we work out that day or how we feel that day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And I also think though too, like, well, so going back to one of your comments is like, yeah, you used to have these athletes that they're like, they wake up and they're so disconnected from what they're actually feeling. They just look at their number and then they're like, oh, day's ruined. My HRV is 0. Like, oh, you'd be dead at that point. But my HRV is really low. I used to do that, and it used to stress me out really, really bad.
Yeah.
Because I'd be like, man, I thought I slept well, like all this other stuff. And so for somebody like me, this is not probably a tool that I should be relying on,
right?
Because it stresses me out more and probably depresses my HRV even more than just being like, okay, how do I actually feel today? And then seeing how I feel during my workouts as well.
Right.
Because there's days where I wake up and I feel like absolute garbage because I actually kind of woke up like the dogs were barking or something like that. But then like get my water in me, get my cup of coffee, and I'm like, boom, I'm ready. I feel great. And then I go and have a great workout. On the flip side of things, there's other days where I wake up and I'm just like, yeah, life is going to be great today. And then, about 2 hours later, I'm like, oh, life is not going to be great today. I'm exhausted now.
So I don't know if I've brought this up before, but I use this analogy all the time and send it to my athletes. Do you watch The Office?
I have in the past, yeah.
Okay, so there's an episode where Michael and Dwight are driving to a sales call or something, and they're in a rental car that has GPS, and so the GPS is telling them like, oh, like turn this way or whatever, and Dwight starts yelling at Michael like, no, like we're driving into a lake, and Michael's like, no, it knows, the computer knows, like, and then they continue to drive the car into a lake and have to swim out of it. But it's like, that's what I see so many times, is that we just like blindly follow these things despite all these other messages that tell us that like maybe it doesn't know.
Yes. Yeah. And I think too, like you said, everybody is searching for like the one metric to rule them all, and there's not one. If there was, then pharmaceutical companies would have already monetized it, and there would be no more exploration or research or anything like that if there was one thing that allowed for everything to be perfect. So I do think though, right, that there is a use, just like I was saying, there's a use for lactate, right? HRV can be very useful for exploring how different things affect your overnight HRV, how different training sessions, different interventions like ice tub, hot bath, slight dehydration, changing your glycogen stores, changing from a high-fat diet to a carbohydrate diet, or vice versa. You can probably get an indication of how your body is responding to that. You just have to be a little bit more meticulous than, oh, I'm just going to put the ring on and I'm just going to see if it changes over time. Because if you're not taking into account all the other things that are also changing to change that output variable, then you're not going to get a good idea of what the heck's actually going on. So that's actually, I think that's my biggest takeaway, is that you can't just take, one piece of technology, one variable, one number, and expect it to give you all the answers. You also have to be integrated with how your body is feeling. You have to be integrated with how your performance is changing. You have to be integrated with how your heart rate and your internal physiology is responding to this sort of stuff. And it just requires you to be a lot more meticulous with the types of things that you're actually monitoring, right? Because there are some people who are like, and I think like a continuous glucose monitor, it's a little bit different, but they're like, oh yeah, every time I eat X, I get this massive spike in glucose. And it's not supposed to spike glucose. And it's an indication that maybe they're allergic to it and having a massive stress response to it or something like that. So, but they would only become aware of that if they knew to potentially be looking at, it's the grapes that I eat, right? And isolating those variables and testing with those single variables. Because if you're constantly changing a ton of different variables, then you're not going to get any valuable outcome, because you're like, well, it could have been the peanut butter and jelly sandwich, or the stressful fight I had with my my spouse, or the run that I did right before bed, or the or the heat and stress that I did before bed as well. That's 4 different variables. You have no idea what the heck's actually changing anything at that point. So you need to isolate and test and be a scientist, I guess.
Yeah. And I'll say my big takeaway here is, because I'm always guilty of shitting on everything, I think the benefit of these things, like wearables in general, is if it can bring your attention to it. So if it makes people pay attention to, I tend to go, like, I've been going to bed after 10 o'clock every night, or like things like that. If it makes you pay attention to your sleep habits or your recovery habits and things like that, then I think they can be a good tool. But again, like, it's not the only tool. It's something to be used with the other things you're using.
Yep, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. I do appreciate the fact, Dave, that you're like, yeah, I do have a tendency to shit on things, but there are some benefits to it. And I do like that. I think any tool, when appropriately used, can be beneficial. Just don't put all of your, eggs in one basket, one tool basket. Use a lot of different tools and recalibrate accordingly. Well, we hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Fast Physiology, all about HRV. You can always find me to ask more questions on Instagram at Critical02. You can comment down below if you're on YouTube, or you can comment if you're on Spotify. If you're enjoying these episodes and you got this far into this episode, go ahead and give us a 5-star review on Spotify. Oh, and I also should mention that we are not cross-posting, but we are doing like every other week, posting a Fast Physiology topic on Dave's channel, which is Training Babble. So that's his podcast. You can find Dave on Instagram at Kaizen Endurance. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to him. I'm sure he would be more than happy to either answer a question for you or point you in the direction of somebody who can answer that. So we hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.